Across the world, tensions are rising. Nations are shifting. Conflicts are growing. And systems that once seemed stable are beginning to shake. History reminds us of something important. When the foundations of powerful nations begin to crack, empires can fall faster than anyone expects.
Goliath, this is 3-2 Echo. We are in sector. Gunner scanning the thermals. Break. White Chicken 07.
Current relative speed to be 12 minutes.
Right.
Active contact forward about 4 miles, 21.
Right. Right.
It ain't that bad.
Take clear to port. Right.
It ain't no way we got your starboard on board.
Right.
History has a way of speaking, if we're willing to listen. Kingdoms rise. Empires stretch their power across oceans and continents. They build monuments, armies, economies, systems that seem unshakable. For a time, they look invincible. But if you read the pages of history carefully, you'll notice something. Every empire that ever stood eventually fell. Rome, the Ottomans, the Mongols, the British Empire that once ruled a quarter of the earth. Powerful nations that seemed permanent in their time, but none of them lasted forever. Because empires rarely collapse by accident, they collapse by pattern. When historians look back at the fall of great powers, the same warning signs appear again and again and again. Civilizations don't usually crumble overnight. Most of the time, they decay slowly, from the inside, like a great tree that still stands tall on the outside, but whose roots have already begun to rot beneath the soil. And when you study the fall of empires, you begin to see the same story unfold. Most nations begin with strong foundations: discipline, sacrifice, responsibility, a sense that everyone has a part to play in building something greater than themselves. But over time, those values can fade. Leadership becomes consumed with power instead of service. Public office becomes a pathway to wealth. And citizens, tired and distracted, begin chasing comfort more than purpose. Duty fades, discipline fades, loyalty to the nation becomes weaker. Historians often say this happened in the later days of the Roman Empire. A society once known for discipline and civic duty slowly gave way to corruption, excess, and moral decay. And when the spirit of a people begins to weaken, the strength of the nation weakens with it. Empires also fall when the economic foundation begins to crack. At first, the warning signs are quiet. Debt begins to rise. Taxes become heavier on the people. Prices climb higher and higher until ordinary families begin to struggle just to live. Meanwhile, wealth becomes concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. A small elite grows richer, while the majority of the population carries the weight of the system. This creates pressure, frustration, and eventually, instability. In the later years of Rome, heavy taxation and inflation began to crush the economy that once fueled the empire's growth. And when the economic engine of a nation begins to fail, the empire begins to wobble. Another sign of a declining empire is political chaos. Leadership stops being about guidance and becomes a fight for control. Power struggles replace governance. Leaders compete against each other instead of working for the stability of the nation. Institutions stop functioning the way they were designed to. And when that happens, people begin to lose trust. they begin to question the system itself. Rome experienced periods where emperors were assassinated or overthrown one after another. Dozens of rulers rising, falling, being replaced through conflict and intrigue. A nation cannot remain stable when its leadership is constantly at war with itself. Success can also become a nation's greatest challenge. Empires expand. They conquer territory, stretch their borders, extend their influence across the world. But eventually, expansion creates a new problem. The empire becomes too large to control. Borders stretch for thousands of miles. Armies must defend distant lands. Military spending becomes enormous, and the cost of maintaining power begins to outweigh the benefits of the empire itself. The British Empire once ruled territories on nearly every continent, but maintaining that global dominance eventually became too expensive, too complicated, too fragile. Even the most powerful empires can reach a point where the system becomes too heavy to carry. Another warning sign appears when societies become deeply divided. When the gap between rich and poor grows wider and wider. When some communities feel the system works for them, while others feel locked out of opportunity. Frustration begins to grow. Faith in the system begins to weaken. Internal tension begins to rise. Throughout history, inequality has often fueled unrest, revolutions, and internal conflict. Because when people feel they have nothing left to lose, they stop believing in the structures that once held society together. Strong nations are built on unity, a shared identity, a belief that despite differences, people are part of the same story. But when that unity begins to dissolve, the empire becomes fragile. Different groups compete for power. Regional interests replace national identity. People stop seeing themselves as part of a collective future. The later Ottoman Empire struggled with this as different groups within the empire began demanding independence. Once unity dissolves, the structure of the empire begins to crack. Even a weakened empire can survive for a time, but eventually, pressure comes from the outside. Rival powers rise. Trade competition increases. Military threats appear along the borders. External forces push against the system that is already struggling internally. The Western Roman Empire, weakened by internal problems, was finally brought down by invasions from Germanic tribes. The outside pressure didn't create the weakness, it simply exposed it. Perhaps the most dangerous sign of all is when people stop believing in the institutions that hold a nation together. Government, law, justice, faith. When citizens believe those systems are fair, societies function. But when people begin to feel those systems no longer serve them, trust begins to collapse. And when trust collapses, the structure holding the empire together begins to fall apart from within. History is not just a record of the past, it is a mirror. And when we study the rise and fall of civilizations, we begin to recognize the patterns. Moral decay, economic pressure, political chaos, social division, external threats. These are the fingerprints left behind when great powers begin to weaken. And the question history quietly asks every generation is this: are these patterns only part of the past, or do they sometimes appear again in the present? History has a way of revealing itself through patterns. Moments when the world begins to shift. When systems that once felt stable begin to feel uncertain, when events in distant places suddenly begin affecting everyday life. And today, many people can feel that something in the world is changing. Across the globe, tensions between nations continue to grow. Military alliances are shifting. Regional conflicts are intensifying. Strategic waterways and trade routes are becoming areas of concern once again. In the Middle East, the balance of power remains fragile. The region sits near one of the most critical shipping corridors in the world, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water that carries a significant portion of the world's oil supply. If instability affects that route, the impact does not remain in the region. Energy markets react. Transportation costs rise. The price of goods begins to climb. And what begins as a geopolitical crisis eventually reaches communities thousands of miles away. Because in today's interconnected world, global instability rarely stays contained. War affects trade. Trade affects supply chains. Supply chains affect the cost of everyday life. At the same time, economic pressures continue to shape the reality many families are navigating. Across the country, industries are changing. Some jobs have disappeared. Others have become less stable than they once were. For many households, unemployment or underemployment has become part of the economic landscape. Even families who remain employed are often facing rising costs in housing, transportation, and basic necessities. The sense of economic security that previous generations once relied on has become harder to predict. And when economic uncertainty grows, entire communities begin to feel the strain. Food security has also become part of the national conversation. For many households, assistance programs have helped families manage rising grocery prices and economic challenges. Programs like SNAP have served as an important support system for millions of people. But when discussions arise about potential reductions or disruptions to those programs, many families begin asking serious questions about the future. What happens if the systems people depend on begin to change? What happens if economic shocks disrupt the flow of resources communities rely on? Questions like these are becoming more common in many households. Political decisions are also shaping the environment communities must navigate. Changes to district boundaries, debates about representation, and discussions about who holds influence in the political process have become major conversations across the country. For communities that have historically struggled for representation, these decisions carry long-term consequences. Because political power affects policies that shape education, housing, economic opportunity, and public investment. At the same time, the way history itself is remembered has become part of the national conversation. Across the country, discussions are taking place about how Black history is taught, how cultural heritage is preserved, and how the contributions of previous generations are honored. For many people, these conversations are not simply academic. They are deeply personal. Because history is not only about the past, history shapes identity. History shapes how communities understand their place in the world. Meanwhile, conversations about justice, policing, and public safety continue to shape the relationship between communities and institutions. These discussions are part of a broader effort across the nation to address concerns about fairness, accountability, and trust. For many families, these issues are not abstract debates. They are questions about safety, dignity, and the future of their communities. Taken one at a time, each of these developments might appear unrelated. A global conflict, an economic challenge, a political debate, a social issue. But when several of these pressures begin appearing at the same time, history teaches us that societies are entering moments of transition. Moments when the future becomes less predictable. Moments when communities begin to ask deeper questions. Questions about identity. Questions about resilience. Questions about what it will take to endure uncertain times. For Black communities in America, these kinds of moments are not unfamiliar. Our history has been shaped by periods of uncertainty before. Times when systems did not provide security. Times when communities had to rely on their own strength, unity, and faith to endure. And in those moments, our people searched not only for practical solutions, but also for deeper understanding, for meaning, for identity, for answers about who we are and where we come from. For generations, our people have searched for answers. Who are we? Where do we come from? And why has our story been scattered across so many lands and histories? But long before modern historians debated these questions, the scriptures spoke of a people who would be scattered to the four corners of the earth. A people carried away into distant lands. A people who would remember their identity again in the last days. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 through 12. Across continents and generations, that scattering has been part of our history. A people taken from their homeland, spread across nations, living among many cultures and languages. But the same scriptures that spoke of scattering also spoke of awakening, a time when the children of Israel would begin to remember who they are, a time when knowledge would increase, when truth long buried would begin to surface again, and when people who once felt disconnected from their history would begin searching again for their identity and their purpose. The scriptures also speak about the condition of the world during that same period of awakening. In the Gospel of Matthew, the Messiah warned about the signs that would appear in the last days. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places. Matthew chapter 24, verse 7. Conflicts between nations, global instability, uncertainty spreading across societies. These moments are not described as the end itself, but as the beginning of a period of testing. A time when the world enters a season of shaking. But the scriptures also speak words of hope in the midst of that uncertainty. The Gospel of Luke records another message. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Luke chapter 21, verse 28. When the world begins to shake, when systems begin to shift, when uncertainty spreads across nations, those moments are also reminders that history is moving toward a greater purpose, a redemption, a restoration, a gathering of a people who once believed they were forgotten. But the scriptures also carry another warning, a reminder that the journey toward restoration requires endurance. The Messiah said, "But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." Matthew chapter 24, verse 13. Endurance, perseverance, faith. These qualities have always defined the survival of our people. Through slavery, through segregation, through economic struggle, through generations of adversity, our communities endured. And that endurance is part of the story that brought us here today. And so we arrive at an important moment, a moment where the world around us appears uncertain, a moment where the pressures of history, economics, politics, and identity all seem to converge. But history has shown us something powerful. Our communities have faced uncertain times before, and when those moments came, we did not simply wait. We organized. We built networks of support. We strengthened our communities. We prepared ourselves and our families to endure. So today, the question is not simply what is happening in the world. The question is, what will we do now? Do we wait for events to unfold around us? Or do we begin organizing our communities again? Do we prepare for uncertainty? Do we build stronger networks of cooperation and support? Do we strengthen our families, our neighborhoods, and our communities so that we can endure whatever challenges may come? Because history, scripture, and experience all teach the same lesson. Communities that prepare, endure. Communities that unite, survive. Communities that organize become stronger than the storms around them. And that is why we have gathered here today. Not simply to observe the moment we are living in, but to discuss how we move forward together, how we organize, how we prepare, and how we strengthen our communities for the days ahead. Let the conversation begin.